The wind in Wyoming doesn't just whisper, it screams. It carries the kind of grit that gets in your teeth, under your skin. It claws at the wood of your cabin and reminds you that you're alone. Always alone. Thomas knew that wind better than any man. It was the same wind that howled the night his first wife, Clara, took her last breath. It was the same wind that rattled the windows while he buried 2 winters' worth of hope in the frozen ground. Now he stood on the platform of the Cheyenne Stage Depot, the wind whipping his coat, and waited for another Clara to arrive. He wasn't looking for love. That had been buried with the first one. He was looking for a pair of hands, a person to stand against the silence, a $5 solution to a $1,000 problem. The advertisement was worn thin in his pocket. Respectable woman, 21. No family. Knows how to cook, clean, tend a home. Will marry upon arrival. It was a cattle auction, and he despised himself for it. He watched the other men on the platform, their eyes hungry and desperate. He was one of them. Then the stagecoach groaned to a halt. The door swung open, and she stepped down into the dust. She wasn't what he expected. The brown dress was plain, yes. Her hair was pinned too tight, an attempt to look older than 21. But her eyes, they stopped him cold. They weren't the eyes of a hopeful girl looking for a new start. They were steady, unflinching. They were the eyes of a woman who had seen the end of the world and hadn't bothered to look away. She scanned the line of men, her gaze passing over them like they were nothing more than fence posts. Then her eyes landed on him. They didn't just see him, they measured him, weighed him. "You, Thomas," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. His throat went dry. "I am." "You must be Clara," he managed, the name feeling like a ghost on his tongue. She gave a single, sharp nod. At her feet were 2 battered carpet bags. He reached for them, expecting some hesitation, but she let them go without a word. The first one was light, filled with clothes, he guessed. But the second one was heavy, unnaturally heavy. It nearly pulled his arm from its socket. He grunted, shifting the weight, his eyes flashing to her face. She just watched him, her expression unreadable. What in God's name was she carrying in there? They walked to his wagon, the silence between them stretching thin and tight. He felt the awkwardness of it, the transactional nature of their meeting. But she carried herself with a strange dignity, as if this was all beneath her, a chore to be completed. Once they were on the wagon seat, the wheels rattling over the hard-packed earth, she finally spoke again. "How far to your farm?" "About an hour west." She didn't look at the small cluster of buildings that made up Cheyenne. She turned her head and stared out at the endless plains, where the wind bent the grass into restless waves. "How close are the neighbors?" It was an odd first question. "Not about the soil, or the cattle, or the house." "Not close," he said. "The nearest is the Miller place, 5 miles east." "Do they visit often?" "Not often. People keep to themselves out here." She seemed to relax then, just a fraction, a slight lowering of her shoulders. She looked at the horizon as if searching for something, or someone. "Then we best get going," she said, her voice flat. "Light's going fast." The ride was a long hour of rattling wheels and that heavy silence. Thomas kept stealing glances at her. She was perfectly still, staring out at the landscape as it rolled by, her hands folded in her lap. He found himself talking, filling the quiet with words he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. He told her about the drought, the 2 cows he'd buried, the bank letters he'd stopped opening. The words just came spilling out, drawn by her intense, unnerving stillness. She was like a deep, dark well, and he was just dropping stones into her, listening for an echo that never came. When the small cabin and barn finally appeared nestled in the low hills, he felt a pang of shame. It wasn't much. It was a place on the edge of failure. He helped her down, gesturing toward the house. "I have a spare room. You can stay there until we figure it out." She didn't look at the house. She looked at him. Her eyes bored into him for a long, silent moment. Then she gave her reply, simple and sharp as a shard of glass. "You paid $5 for a wife, not a house guest." He blinked, startled by the force of it. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know." Her voice softened, but the steel remained. "But I agreed to marry. So, Let's marry. It wasn't a request, it was a command. And standing there in the dying light, with the wind howling around them and the weight of that strange, heavy bag still in his hand, Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He had sent for a partner to help him survive. But he was beginning to suspect he had invited the storm itself right into his home. The next morning, with a traveling reverend presiding, they did it. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. Thomas wore a clean shirt. Clara wore the same brown dress. No guests, no flowers, just two signatures in a church ledger that smelled of dust and mildew. As they stood before the reverend, Thomas watched her. Her hand in his was steady, not a single tremor. He looked down and saw it. A small, strange scar on the inside of her wrist. It was pale and old, shaped almost like a letter, a brand. His mind reeled. What kind of woman gets a brand on her wrist? But the Reverend was speaking, and then it was over. They were man and wife. It wasn't romance. It was a contract. But as Thomas looked at the woman standing beside him, he realized he didn't know the first thing about the terms of the deal he had just made. Back at the farm, she didn't wait for him to give orders. The morning after their 10-minute wedding, Clara rolled up her sleeves as if the vows themselves were a summons to work. But it was a strange kind of work. She didn't start in the kitchen. She didn't ask about the mending. First, she walked the property, the entire perimeter. Her eyes scanned the horizon, the low hills, the creek bed. She was mapping it, learning the lines of sight, the places to hide. Then she came inside. She checked the lock on the front door, rattling it in its frame. She inspected the windows, noting which ones had a clear view of the wagon trail. "I'm not here to replace her," she said, finally meeting his eyes across the rough-hewn table. He knew she meant his first Clara. "But I don't give up easy." Day by day, those words became a chilling truth. She climbed onto the roof beside him to patch leaks, her movements sure and steady. She knelt in the straw to help birth a calf, her hands unflinching at the slick, new life. She was everything the advertisement promised. Strong, capable, willing, but there was something else. A current running just beneath the surface. A week after she arrived, a coyote got bold. It prowled too close to the henhouse in the gray light of dawn. Thomas reached for his rifle, but Clara was already there. She leveled the gun, her stance firm, her body perfectly still. He expected her to fire a warning shot to scare it off. She didn't. The rifle cracked, the sound sharp and final in the morning air. The coyote dropped where it stood, a single clean shot from 50 yards. Thomas stared. He was a decent shot himself, but that was the work of an expert. He walked over to her, his mind struggling to make sense of it. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the dead animal, her face a mask. "You learn what you have to," she said, her voice low and even, "to survive." That night, the house was quiet. The chores were done. Darkness pressed in on the small cabin. He'd heard muffled sobs through the wall before, and he'd left them alone. Some grief, he figured, was best honored with silence. But tonight, he didn't hear crying. He heard the floorboards creak, a soft rhythmic sound. Curiosity got the better of him. He rose from his bed, his bare feet silent on the cold wood floor. He crept to the thin wall that separated their rooms and peered through a small crack in the planks. His blood ran cold. Clara was not in bed. She was sitting on the floor, a single candle burning beside her, casting long, dancing shadows on the wall. And she wasn't crying. She was cleaning a gun. It wasn't his rifle. It was a small pearl-handled pistol, a lady's gun, but there was nothing ladylike about the way she handled it. Her movements were practiced, efficient, deadly. She oiled the mechanism with a focused intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. She was preparing for war. Thomas backed away from the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The mail-order bride, the expert shot, the secret pistol, the heavy bag he'd carried from the station. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman with a past she was determined to keep hidden. And as he lay in his bed, listening to the soft click and scrape of metal on metal from the next room, he knew one thing for certain. Clara wasn't running from a memory. She was running from a man. And she expected him to find her. The farm's rhythm held for another few weeks. A tense, fragile peace settled over the cabin. Thomas worked alongside Clara, their conversations always skirting the edge of the truth. He never mentioned the pistol. She never explained the scar. They were two strangers tied together by a piece of paper. each waiting for the other to reveal their hand. Then, one gray afternoon, the peace shattered. Thomas was mending the north pasture fence when he saw them. Two small figures, stumbling through the tall grass, trembling against the wind. A boy, maybe 8 years old, his face stiff with a desperate sort of pride. He was holding the hand of a little girl, no more than 5, whose lips were blue with cold. Orphans. The plains were full of them. Stories of families broken apart by sickness or weather. He crouched low, keeping his voice gentle. Where are your folks? The boy lifted his chin, though his lips trembled. Gone. Thomas's heart ached. Without another word, he scooped them up, the little girl a feather in his arms, the boy stiff and resisting. He carried them toward the house. He expected Clara to be surprised. He expected questions. He got something else entirely. She met him at the door, her eyes widening as she saw the children, but the look on her face wasn't pity, it wasn't compassion, it was stark, naked fear. Her face went white as a sheet. She didn't look at their worn shoes or threadbare coats. She looked past them, her eyes scanning the empty plains behind them with frantic energy. Get them inside, she hissed, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She practically dragged them over the threshold and slammed the door, dropping the thick wooden bar into place. The sound echoed in the sudden silence of the cabin. She knelt in front of the boy, ignoring Thomas completely. Her hands gripped his small shoulders. Did anyone see you? She demanded, her voice shaking. Did you see a man following you? The boy was too terrified to speak. He just stared at her, his eyes wide. Answer me, she snapped, giving him a little shake. A tall man on a black horse, a silver star on his chest. Did you see him? A silver star? A lawman? The boy finally found his voice, a terrified squeak. No, no one. We just saw the smoke from your chimney. Clara let out a long, shuddering breath. The tension seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving her limp. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them and looked at Thomas. The fear was gone, replaced by that familiar, unyielding steel. They stay, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a declaration. No questions asked. Later that night, after the children, Henry and Hope, had been fed and wrapped in quilts by the fire, she finally offered a piece of her story. But it wasn't the one he expected. She sat across from him, the firelight casting shadows on her face. I wasn't abandoned, she said, her voice quiet but steady. I ran. She paused, taking a breath. I ran from a lawman, a U.S. Marshal. He thinks I did something terrible. She looked down at her hands. He's been hunting me for 2 years. He won't stop until he finds me. Thomas stared at her, the pieces clicking together into a terrifying picture. The pistol, the shooting skills, the constant watchfulness, the fear when she saw the children. She thought they had been followed. She thought the marshal had finally caught up to her. He had married a fugitive. He had brought a woman on the run from the law into his home, into his life. He looked over at the 2 small children sleeping by the hearth, their faces finally peaceful in the warm glow. They were innocent. They were caught in the middle of something they couldn't possibly understand. And so was he. What did he think you did? Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Clara looked up, and her eyes were filled with a darkness that swallowed the firelight. He thinks I killed a man. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any secret she had kept before. A killer. The woman he had married, the woman sleeping under his roof, might be a killer. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to see innocence in her eyes. But as he looked at her steady, unflinching gaze, he saw a survivor. A woman who would do whatever it took to keep running. And he had no idea if he was her partner or just part of her cover. Life in the cabin changed. It was no longer just tents. It was a fortress. Clara's days were a routine of chores and vigilance. She taught Henry how to carry water, yes, but she also taught him the quietest way to move through the woods. She showed him how to set snares, not just for rabbits, but the kind that could trip a man in the dark. She fashioned a rag doll for Hope, but she also taught the little girl a game, a hiding game. When Clara would whisper the word shadow, Hope was to run to a designated spot, a loose planked crawl space under the hearth, and not make a sound until she heard a special knock. She was training them, turning them into soldiers in her private war. Thomas watched it all with a growing sense of dread. He was living a lie. This quiet family scene was a facade, a stage play designed to fool anyone who might come looking. One afternoon, he found Hope down by the creek, crying silently into the skirt of her dress. He sat beside her on the smooth stones. "What's wrong, little one?" he asked gently. She looked up at him, her eyes full of confusion. "Henry says she's not our real sister," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He says Clara is just a name she uses." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. He found Henry by the woodpile, splitting kindling with a grim determination that was unnatural for a boy his age. Thomas put a hand on his shoulder. "Henry, tell me the truth. Who is she?" The boy flinched, dropping the axe. He looked trapped, terrified. But then he lifted his chin, that same stubborn defiance Thomas had seen on the first day. "She found us," Henry said, the words rushing out. "In a mission in St. Louis. Our he was gone. Ma was sick. Clara came one night. She gave us food. She said she'd protect us. She said a bad man was hunting her, and if we pretended to be her family, she could keep us all safe. She promised she'd get us to a place where no one could ever hurt us again." So it was all a lie. The children weren't just orphans she'd taken in. They were part of her disguise. She had found two parentless children and woven them into her story, using their innocence as a shield. A cold fury mixed with a sickening sense of betrayal washed over Thomas. He had opened his home, his life, to this woman. He had started to feel something, a connection, a hope he hadn't felt in years, and it was all built on sand. He stormed back to the cabin, his fists clenched. Clara was at the table, kneading dough, her movements calm and rhythmic. She looked up as he entered, and she must have seen the thunder on his face. She stopped, her hands covered in flour. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "They're not your family. You used them." Clara didn't flinch. She wiped her hands on her apron, her gaze as steady as ever. "I did what I had to do," she said. "For them. And for me." "Who are you?" he demanded, stepping closer. "What is your real name?" She just looked at him, her jaw set like stone. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of his own heart. He saw the calculation in her eyes. How much to tell him? How much to keep hidden? Before she could answer, there was a sound from outside. The slow, steady beat of a horse's hooves approaching on the trail. Clara's head snapped toward the window. The color drained from her face. In an instant, the hard, defiant woman was gone, replaced by the terrified fugitive he'd seen the day the children arrived. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Hope, who had been listening from the corner, didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the floor and disappeared into the tiny crawl space beneath the hearth. Henry flattened himself behind a stack of firewood. Clara grabbed the rifle from its place above the mantelpiece. She moved not to the door, but to the side window, pressing herself flat against the wall, using the frame as cover. Thomas was frozen, his anger forgotten, replaced by a primal fear. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. The man she was running from was here. The hoofbeats stopped. A long silence. Then a voice called out, not loud, but carrying easily in the still air. "Clara, I know you're in there. Just a friendly visit. From family." Thomas looked at Clara. Her knuckles were white on the rifle stock. The voice was unfamiliar. It wasn't a marshal's stern command. It was something else. Something almost sly. A shadow fell across the doorway. A man stood there, his hand raised in a mock greeting. He was thin and wiry, with restless eyes that darted around the cabin, taking in every detail. "Don't you recognize your own brother?" the man said with a crooked smile. But Clara didn't lower the rifle. Her eyes were narrowed, her aim steady. "You're not my brother," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "My brother is dead." The man's smile faltered. He took a half step back, his hand inching toward the pistol at his hip. "Now, Abby, that ain't a nice way to greet family." Abby, not Clara. The man wasn't her brother, and her name wasn't Clara. The lies were unraveling so fast Thomas could barely keep up. The man took another look around the cabin, his eyes landing on the small, hand-carved rocking horse Thomas had made for Hope. "He knows," the man said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He knows you have the kids. He's on his way." Suddenly, there was another sound. Faint, but growing closer. More horses. At least two of them. Coming fast. The man who called himself her brother cursed under his breath. He looked at Clara, then at the approaching riders. "This wasn't the plan, Abby. You were supposed to be alone." He turned and bolted, leaping onto his horse and spurring it into a gallop, disappearing over the nearest hill just as two riders appeared on the horizon. One of them was a tall man on a black horse, and the sun glinted off the silver star on his chest. The marshal was here, and Thomas was standing in the middle of a trap with a woman he didn't know, who was holding a rifle on the law. The two riders slowed their approach, stopping 100 yards from the cabin. The marshal dismounted, his movements calm and deliberate. The other man, a younger deputy, stayed on his horse, a rifle held ready across his saddle. "Abigail Finch!" The marshal's voice boomed across the yard. "This is U.S. Marshal Kane. You've led me on a long chase. It's over." Abigail Finch. So that was her name. Thomas looked at her. Her face was a pale, sweat-slicked mask of concentration. Her rifle was still aimed squarely at the marshal's chest. "You in the cabin!" Kane called out, his voice directed at Thomas. "Send the woman out. You won't be harmed." Thomas's mind was a whirlwind. Abigail, a liar, a fugitive, maybe a killer. The man who'd just fled. He'd called himself her brother, but she'd said her brother was dead. He was part of this. He had led the marshal here. "He's lying," Abigail whispered, her voice tight. "He's not here to arrest me. He's here to kill me." "Why?" Thomas whispered back. "What did you do?" "It's not what I did," she hissed. "It's what I have." Marshal Kane took a few steps forward, his hands held out to his sides, showing they were empty. "Don't be a fool, Abby. There are two children in there. Think of them. Just give me the ledger and we can all walk away." The ledger. Not money, not jewels. A book. The answer had to be in that heavy carpet bag. The bag that had been sitting by the door since the day she arrived. It was filled with names, she'd said. Important names. "Who's the man who was just here?" Thomas demanded. "The one who called you Abby?" "Garrett," she breathed, not taking her eyes off Kane. "He was my father's partner. He betrayed him. He betrayed me. He's been working with Kane all along. He tracked me here." It was a setup. Garrett had come, pretending to be a warning, but he was just confirming she was here, confirming she had the children. He had led the law right to her door. "Last chance, Finch!" Kane shouted. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood. "Send out the children. Then you come out with your hands empty. Or we're coming in." Thomas looked at the woman beside him. Her knuckles were bone white on the rifle stock. He saw the terror in her eyes, but underneath it, a furious, cornered desperation. She was not going to surrender. She was going to fight. And if he stayed, he would be caught in the crossfire. His farm, his life, everything he had painstakingly rebuilt from ash would be destroyed. He could walk out. He could tell the marshal she'd forced him, that he was a victim. He could save himself. But then he looked past her, into the shadows of the cabin. He saw a flash of movement, hope, peeking out from under the hearth. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, her eyes wide with a terror no child should ever know. He thought of his first Clara, taken by a winter he couldn't fight. He thought of his farm, nearly lost to a bank he couldn't reason with. For 2 years, he had been passive, a victim of circumstance, of weather, of fate. He had let the world happen to him. Marshal Kane raised his hand, a signal to the deputy. The sun touched the edge of the world. In that instant, Thomas made a choice. He reached up and took his own rifle from the pegs above the fireplace. The weight of it was familiar, solid. Abigail flinched, turning to look at him, her eyes wide with shock. She thought he was going to turn on her. He didn't. He walked to the other window, checked the load, and leveled the barrel, aiming it not at her, but at the deputy sitting on the horse. "Get off my land," Thomas said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a final decision. Abigail stared at him, her mouth slightly open. For the first time since she had stepped off that stagecoach, her mask of cool composure was completely gone. She looked stunned. Outside, Marshal Kane chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You're making a big mistake, farmer," he called out. "You're harboring a fugitive, a murderer." "Did you do it?" Thomas asked her then, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on the deputy outside. "Did you kill that man?" She finally looked away from him, her gaze turning inward, to the past she'd been running from. When she spoke, her voice was raw, stripped of all its defenses. "No," she whispered. "My father was a clerk for the railroad. He wasn't a thief. He found something. A ledger. It detailed a scheme. Railroad barons, politicians, skimming profits, taking land grants they weren't entitled to. They were robbing the country blind. He was going to expose them." She took a shaky breath. "The man who died was a Pinkerton agent named Cole. He wasn't a lawman. He was their hired muscle. He came to our house for the ledger. He tried to take it from my father. They fought." Her eyes filled with tears, the first true tears he had ever seen from her. "My father killed him. It was self-defense. Cole would have killed us both. But no one would have believed it. Not against those powerful men. So we ran. My father died of a fever a month later in Missouri. Before he died, he told me to keep the ledger safe, to get it to someone who could use it, someone honest." She looked over at the crawlspace where Hope was hiding. "Henry and Hope, their father was a newspaperman in St. Louis. I went to him. I thought he was that honest someone. He believed me. He was going to publish the story. But they found him first. They made it look like an accident. I found the children before Kane's men could get to them to silence them." It all clicked into place. The lies, the running, the gun. She wasn't a criminal. She was a protector, a guardian of a dangerous truth, and she had been doing it all alone. "The ledger," Thomas said, his voice thick. "It's in the heavy bag." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "It's been right there the whole time." Outside, Kane was losing patience. "Time's up!" he roared. "We're coming in!" Thomas saw the deputy raise his rifle. He didn't hesitate. He fired. Not at the man, but at the ground just in front of his horse. The animal screamed and reared, throwing the surprised deputy into the dirt. The shot was a declaration, a line drawn in the dust. This was his land. This was his home. And these were his people. "There's a dry creek bed that runs from behind the barn to the woods," Thomas said, his voice urgent and sharp. "It'll give you cover for a quarter mile. Get the children. Get the ledger. Go, now!" "What about you?" she asked, her eyes locked on his. "This is my fight now, too," he said. "I'm done running from storms." She gave him one last look, a look that held 1,000 unspoken words. Then she moved. She grabbed Henry from his hiding spot, pulled Hope from the crawlspace, and slung the heavy carpet bag over her shoulder. With the children in tow, she slipped out the back door and disappeared into the twilight. Thomas waited, counting the seconds. He heard the shouts from outside as Kane and his deputy realized what was happening. He moved from window to window, firing his rifle, keeping their heads down, buying her time. He was one man, a simple farmer, against a U.S. Marshal. The odds were impossible. He knew it. But as he chambered another round, the smell of gunpowder filling his small cabin, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange sense of peace. He was no longer a man haunted by the past. He was a man fighting for a future. He saw a flicker of movement outside. The deputy was trying to circle around toward the barn. Thomas drew a bead on him, but before he could fire, another shot rang out, this one from the low ridge to the north. The deputy cried out and dropped his rifle, clutching a bloody hand. Thomas stared in disbelief. Who had fired that shot? Then he saw him, a lone rider on the ridge, silhouetted against the last rays of the dying sun. It was Garrett, the man who had betrayed her, and he was firing on the marshal. The fight for the farm became a chaotic battle in the growing darkness. Garrett, from his position on the ridge, laid down covering fire, pinning Kane and his wounded deputy behind the water trough. It didn't make sense. Why would the man who led the marshal here now be fighting him? Thomas used the confusion to his advantage. He slipped out of the cabin and crept through the shadows toward the barn. He knew this land. Every dip, every rock, every patch of tall grass. Kane was an intruder here, an enemy on foreign soil. He heard Kane shouting curses, his voice raw with fury and frustration. The hunter had become the hunted. From the barn, Thomas could see the whole scene. He saw Garrett dismount and work his way down the ridge, moving with the practiced ease of a soldier. He saw the wounded deputy trying to crawl to safety, and he saw Marshal Kane, his face a mask of rage, trying to get a clear shot at either Thomas or Garrett. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the chaos. The frantic thundering of hooves. A wagon, pulled by two horses, burst out of the woods from the west. At the reins was Abigail, her hair flying wildly behind her. In the back of the wagon, clutching the sides, were Henry and Hope. She wasn't running. She was charging. She drove the wagon straight toward the stunned marshal. It was a desperate, insane gamble. Kane raised his pistol to fire at her, but in that moment, Garrett broke from cover, shouting her name. Abby, no! Garrett's shout was a distraction. It made Kane hesitate for a fraction of a second, his aim shifting toward the new voice. That was all Thomas needed. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and fired. The bullet struck the pistol in Kane's hand, sending it spinning into the dust. The marshal howled in pain and rage, his hand shattered. The wagon thundered past him. Abigail didn't slow down. She drove it straight toward the road leading back to Cheyenne. The wounded deputy, seeing his boss disarmed and the tide of the battle turned, scrambled to his feet and ran off into the darkness. Garrett rushed down to the yard, his rifle still ready. It was over. In the sudden ringing silence, Thomas walked out from the barn. He met Garrett by the water trough where Kane was kneeling, clutching his ruined hand, his face pale in the moonlight. You led him here, Thomas said, his voice flat. It wasn't a question. I did, Garrett admitted, his eyes full of a strange mix of shame and resolve. It was the only way. Kane would never have stopped hunting her. I had to get him out in the open, away from his allies in the city. I had to get him somewhere he could be beaten. He looked at Thomas. I was betting on you, farmer. I heard what kind of man you were, that you had lost a wife, that you were honorable. I bet that when the time came, you'd stand by her. Why? Thomas asked. I thought you were his partner. I was, Garrett said, spitting on the ground near Kane's feet. My pa was a good man. Kane and his railroad bosses ruined him. I joined up with them to get revenge, to destroy them from the inside, but I couldn't get close enough to the proof. Then I heard about Abigail Finch and the ledger her father took. I knew it was my only chance. He looked off in the direction she had fled. I'm not her brother, but I owed her father a debt. Now it's paid. They tied Marshal Kane to a chair in the cabin. The man was defeated, his arrogance replaced by a sullen, venomous silence. An hour later, Abigail returned. She walked into the cabin, the heavy carpet bag in her hand. She looked at Kane, then at Thomas. Her eyes were clear, the fear gone. It's done, she said. She had ridden to the Miller place, the nearest neighbor. Mr. Miller was a former judge, a man known for his rigid honesty. He had listened to her story, looked at the ledger, and sent his fastest son to Cheyenne to fetch the territorial governor. The truth was coming. For the next 2 days, the farm was no longer an isolated homestead. It was the center of a political firestorm. The governor arrived with his own men, took Kane into custody, and secured the ledger. The names in it sent shockwaves all the way to Washington. Railroad barons, senators, judges. The conspiracy Abigail's father had uncovered was bigger than anyone could have imagined. In the end, justice was swift. The powerful men named in the ledger were ruined. Marshal Kane was tried and imprisoned, not just for his corruption, but for the murder of Henry and Hope's father. Abigail Finch was cleared of all charges. Her name, once hunted, was now celebrated in the papers as a hero. She, along with Henry and Hope, were declared witnesses under the protection of the territorial government. When the dust settled, she stood with Thomas on the porch of the small cabin. The officials were gone. The reporters were gone. It was just the two of them, and the two children, who were now sleeping peacefully inside, safe for the first time in their lives. The government has offered me passage east, she said quietly, not looking at him. A new life, a new name, for me and the children. Thomas's heart sank. He looked out at the fields he had worked, the fences he had mended. The silence he had once craved now seemed like a terrible emptiness waiting to reclaim him. You should take it, he said, his voice rough. You deserve a fresh start. A life without ghosts. She was silent for a long moment. Then she turned to him. I already have a new name. she said softly. I'm Clara. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his. I wasn't looking for a hero, Thomas. I was just looking for a safe place to stand. I never expected to find a home. She reached out and took his calloused hand. My whole life I've been running. I don't want to run anymore. He looked down at their joined hands. This woman, who had come to him as a stranger, a collection of lies and secrets, was the bravest person he had ever met. She had fought for truth, protected innocent children, and faced down a corrupt and powerful system. And she had chosen to stay. With him. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he thought had been buried 2 winters ago. It wasn't the ghost of an old love. It was something new. Something forged in fire and truth. A few months later, Thomas returned from town with a folded paper in his pocket. He laid it on the kitchen table where Clara was kneading dough, a light dusting of flour on her nose. It's official, he said, his voice thick with emotion. She wiped her hands and picked up the paper. It was a new deed to the farm, and on it, alongside his name, was hers, Clara. Tears welled in her eyes. She had fled a father who saw her as property. She had lived in a world that saw her as a fugitive. To see her name bound to this land, this home, it was the one thing she had never dared to hope for. This life, Thomas said, his hand covering hers on the deed. This place, it's not just mine anymore. It's ours. The seasons turned. Winters came, blanketing the fields in quiet white. But the cabin was always warm, filled with the sounds of Henry's improving carpentry and Hope's delighted laughter. Springs came, waking the earth, and they planted the fields side by side. One morning, Clara stood by the new row of sunflowers they had planted, her hand resting on her stomach. When Thomas came in from the pasture, she was waiting on the porch, a small, tremulous smile on her face. He knew before she even spoke the words. They were adding to their family. Their son, Elias, was born the following autumn, his cries filling the small cabin with a fierce, wonderful new life. Years passed. The farm thrived. The children grew. Henry, with his steady hands, became a fine carpenter, his work strengthening every corner of their home. Hope, with her bright spirit, filled the house with paintings and stories. And Elias grew up with his father's quiet strength and his mother's unyielding courage. One evening, as their hair silvered and their hands were etched with the stories of a life fully lived, Thomas and Clara sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the fields they had built together. The land that was once a place of survival was now a testament to their love. They had faced down storms, both real and human. They had uncovered a darkness that threatened to swallow them whole. But they hadn't broken. They had chosen to stand, to fight, and to build something new from the ashes of their pasts. Their life wasn't a quiet story. It was a battle, hard fought and won. A reminder that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in peace but are forged in the fires of adversity. What do you think is the true meaning of family? Is it blood, or is it the people you choose to fight for? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of justice in the Old West, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales just like this one.